Hi guys, and thanks very much for joining me today. Now, as we start this lesson, this video, what I want you to do is I want you to think about the symbols I've put in front of you, and you should be able to recognise them as British companies or companies you would recognise. I want you to think, what do they all have in common at the start of 1979? So we've got British Petroleum, British Aerospace, British Airways, British Gas, Jaguar, Rolls-Royce and British Telecom. And in 1979 all these companies are owned by the government. They're nationalised. So it essentially means that the government's responsible for running them, but the government is also taking a profit. Any benefit from these companies comes back to the state. However, things are going to change. So we're going to look at another of Thatcher's economic policies, and we're going to focus on privatisation today. Now what I want you to do, remember that table we talked about last time? I want you to keep referring back to that table, keep adding to it throughout. So remember to keep using that table. We're also going to be focusing on supply side economics today. We talked about demand side. We're going to be focusing on supply side economics today as well. Now before we go any further, there are two key terms that you really need to grasp. One of them you've already met. We started with it all the way back in the 1950s and 1960s, and this idea of denationalisation and privatisation. So I want to make sure you've got that in your notes though. So if you're not too secure about that, if you're not too sure, make sure you've got that definition written down in your notes. And then the same with socialism, a form of government, this idea. I want you to write down a definition of that, because there are going to be two key things that we're going to refer back to later on. So if needs be, pause the video, write those down, and then carry on from there. Now, privatisation. We're going to see share ownership increase dramatically over the period that Margaret Thatcher is Prime Minister. This idea of shares, buying a share of a company. And from 3 million people owning shares in 1979, we end up with 9 million people in 1990. So we need to understand why that happens essentially, this increase in share ownership, this increase of privatisation. Now I think the best way to really understand privatisation during Margaret Thatcher's time as Prime Minister is to look at the companies that are privatised during her time. And so I've created a list for you, looking at her first term in office, second and third. And you can see how these companies are being privatised over time. And it's almost as if in the first term, in that first period, she's getting a hang of it. She's getting used to this idea of privatisation. She's introducing it to the people. And then as we get to the second term in office, she's got the hang of it. The Conservatives like it, the public seem to like it, and therefore she increases it. And we start seeing bigger organisations being privatised, such as British Telecom and British Gas and Rolls-Royce. And you're going to see later on that those three companies alone bring in a phenomenal amount of money to the government. And then as we get towards the third term in office, it's almost as if she's pretty much sold everything she can do. And therefore we've only got British Steel, water supply and electricity supply left to privatise. There are a couple of other bits that she could have privatised. We'll look at that at the end of the lesson, and she chose not to. But essentially you've got an idea of Margaret Thatcher's privatisation throughout her time in office. Now, privatisation, it's this core belief of Thatcherism, and it's driven by an anti-socialist ideology. So remember, I needed you to understand that word socialist at the beginning of this lesson. And privatisation is very much against this socialist idea. Thatcher believes that private individuals are better at spending money than the government. You remember when she reduced income tax rate to ensure that people had more money. Similarly, she believes that private sector is more efficient at delivering goods and services. Private industry is better at running businesses than the government is. And this would mean that businesses would compete often against each other for business, for customers, and it would lead to improvements, it would lead to innovations. So business A would want to be better than business B to get more customers, and therefore they would improve, they would be more efficient, they would have better machinery. So in short, Margaret Thatcher believes that it's going to be business leaders who are better at running companies, such as British Gas, than the state had been, than the government had been. This is the whole idea of privatisation. And I've given you a really simple diagram to explain it in the most basic of terms. And it's almost as if Margaret Thatcher believes nationalised industry is a bit Stone Age, a little bit slow, a little bit old-fashioned, and not really moving with the times. And it's going to be privatised industry, people working together, which is going to be modern, efficient, quick to improve, and provide that level of service that she expects of people. Now, it's also worth remembering that at the same time that Margaret Thatcher's introduced privatisation, she's also reduced public spending. Think back to that first lesson we did when we looked at monetarism. Thatcher's reduced public spending, and this means that government, your local government, what's classed as your district council, so to speak, can't afford or can't provide the services that they used to provide. And so private companies take over those roles, which had previously been provided by the state, and this is known as rolling back of the state. So an example would be refuse collection. Previously, that would have been the district council. Your waste lorry would have turned up with its district council sign on the side of it. They would have got out with the people manning it, collected the waste, and off they would have gone. But it became cheaper for councils to employ a larger company, an independent company, a private company, to collect the waste in their area. And this company would also collect waste in 2 or 3 councils or more in the surrounding area. And that would become more cost efficient for them as well. So this idea of rolling back of the state means the state's no longer providing some services. These are now being provided by private industry. It also means the state essentially is no longer looking after the needs of individuals. Private industry is starting to look after the needs of individuals. Now you can see examples of that today even. Care homes are privatised. Some prison services are privatised as well. However, we really want to be focusing on Thatcher today, so make sure we stay within that period, 1979 to 1990. Now, with such a contentious thing as privatisation, there are clearly going to be supporters and there are going to be opponents. So we need to look at the arguments for both. Now, one of the key supporting reasons for privatisation was it brought in revenue for the government, it brought in cash. Now, I've given you 3 examples there in front of you for Rolls-Royce, British Telecom and British Gas, and you can see the amount that's been brought in. But you can see overall between 1982 and 1990, £27.2 billion was brought in to government revenue. That's a huge amount of money for them to spend on infrastructure, on services, on whatever they feel is appropriate. Another benefit of privatisation is it allows for competition in the marketplace. And it's this idea of different providers competing for work where they'll be more efficient and cheaper. So let's look at that example of the waste bin lorries collecting refuse. Company A will say we can do it for £10,000 a week. So Company B now needs to beat them and will offer to do it at £9,000 per week. So it becomes more efficient. The council's going to choose Company B. It's £9,000 per week. Another example of why privatisation was considered a good thing is that previously politicians could overrule commercial judgments for nationalised industries, and this meant that sometimes they would want a factory to be built in their area where jobs were needed, they felt, or just for them to win the next election, or they may refuse to close an uneconomical plant. Whereas if an industry is privatised, it will focus solely on the economic decision. So it won't be bothered if it needs to close an economical plant. It won't be bothered if they aren't building a factory where jobs are needed. Now, some people would say that's a good thing for privatisation. And finally, privatisation gives people an opportunity to own shares. and see their wealth grow. Now, when I wrote this slide, I previously said it gave everyone an opportunity to own shares and see their wealth grow. But the reality is it doesn't give everybody that opportunity. So if you can't afford to buy shares, you're not going to take part in this opportunity. But if you've got the money, if you've got that cash, you can buy shares and hopefully you will see your wealth grow. So these are the supporting arguments for privatisation. Let's have a look at the opposite then. Now, first of all, the National Audit Office. This is a government department that reviews government spending, that reviews what the government does with money, and then will essentially pass judgment or report to Parliament as to whether the government has been efficient. And the National Audit Office said shares had been sold too cheaply. Basically, they were being sold at a giveaway price, and it was losing the government £2.5 billion in total. Now, that's essentially like selling a car that is worth £10,000 for £8,000 instead. Doesn't seem to make any sense. However, Nigel Lawson, he justifies this. Now, I want you to go into your notes and I need to look at Andrew Marr. How does he justify selling the shares at undervalue? Another reason that people opposed privatisation was that many people who bought the shares sold them for a profit, quite often in a very short period of time later. Thereby, the number of long-term shareholders didn't increase greatly. It didn't become a common thing to have for lots of people to be owning shares. Another reason for people opposing privatisation is that some people lost jobs as they reduced their workforce to cut costs and become more efficient. So let's go back to that refuge company, the one that won the contract for £9,000 a week. In order to be able to do it at £9,000 a week, they now have to cut 10% of their workforce. That means that people are losing jobs for companies to become more efficient. And workers found they couldn't find long-term job security anymore because of this. And because pension provision was quite often tied up with work as well, people were finding they couldn't build up a good pension. And privatisation had resulted in cost being a key factor, rather than quality of service. So people were more interested in what was the least expensive, what was cheapest, as to what was best, both for the community, for the country, and also what was the better quality of service in general. Now, radical Thatcherites, those that were really hard over and supporting Margaret Thatcher, had drawn up plans to expand privatisation during this period. This included the coal industry, the railways, and parts of the NHS. Now, some of this is enacted, but it's in the 1990s, so do not confuse this with the period of Thatcher. This is only an idea that they're looking at. They don't follow this through during Thatcher's time. I've got an interesting long-term view of privatisation here though. It's out of Andrew Marr's History of Modern Britain. I'm going to give you a moment to read that through, so if you need to, pause the video and just read that. Andrew Marr feels the real failure of privatisation is that it didn't result in share ownership becoming deep-rooted within society. There was almost a feeling at the start of this with Margaret Thatcher that owning shares would be as common as owning your own car. And that wasn't the case. Share ownership did not become widespread. Share ownership remained for the few, and quite often it went back to large businesses, pension managers, and wider financial companies that led on share ownership. So, there you have it. Margaret Thatcher and privatisation. I've given you 6 key things I need you to look at now, and to ensure you've covered these in your notes. You may need to go back through the video, but each of these points is answered within the video. Go through the textbook as well, and also read that extract from Andrew Marr that you'll have been sent. But that's it. That's the lesson this week. I want you to send me your notes on Teams, either handwritten or typed up. And as always, if you've got any questions, drop me a line. Thanks very much.